Welcome to Business Insight. I'm Peter Marx. My guest today is Joel Shulman. He's Associate Professor of Entrepreneurship at Babson College. Joel, pleasure to have you with us.
Well, it's a pleasure being here.
I noticed one of your other titles is Managing Director of Entrepreneur Shares. What is that?
Well, it's a publicly traded mutual fund. We started about a year and a half ago. And what it does is invest in publicly traded companies that we deem to be entrepreneurial.
Okay, so slightly different than the Billionaires Index.
It's a little different. We have some overlap, but it's a different product.
Okay, so tell me about the idea behind the Billionaires Index.
Okay, well actually it stemmed from the Entrepreneur Shares Mutual Fund. We started off years ago, well actually to back up a little bit, you may not know this, I also run a hedge fund. So I run long-short equity hedge fund, which in the long side invests in entrepreneurial companies, what we deem to be entrepreneurial companies. So we built a track record for about 5 years and decided to take it to the public. We did that November 10th, 2010. Created a mutual fund, Global Entrepreneurs, that invest in companies around the world. And then we took a subset of that, which is the Forbes list. So there's some relationship. It's not truly a subset. There is overlap, though. Okay,
it's not a fund. It's an index.
Pure index.
Is this something that you'd like people to kind of check with, like the S&P 500 and the Dow Jones? Is that kind of the idea?
Sure. Well, people can't invest in it, so we did it just for fun. We do that as academics once in a while. We do something whimsical like an index, and they cannot invest in it. But we do. Forbes does show I think the top 50 holdings, and Bloomberg I think has 20 holdings. Ours actually has close to 500. So we're hopeful to make this publicly available soon. But it's not for investment purposes, just for entertainment.
Okay, well, it'd be a nice asset if people catch on trying to quote it. Let's talk a little bit about kind of the theories. Now, why do rich people earn more?
Well, the rich get, So in fact, the article is entitled "The Rich Get Richer and So Can You." I think it's the "So Can You" piece that people are really interested in. So what we did is, just for fun, we said, let's go back, as far as we can, 20 years ago, and we looked at the Forbes magazine. So we just assumed that you're going to the drugstore, you spent the $4 or $5 to buy the magazine in March, you had a few weeks in March to look at the magazine, decide which companies are publicly traded that they created their wealth from, and then you bought it April 1st. And we did this every year for 20 years, and we assumed that people had an equally weighted portfolio, there was no thinking about the index, you just buy the magazine, they're in it, you buy them, they're not in it, or they're off, you sell it. That's it. There's no real thought to it. You would have significantly outperformed the market doing this for the last 15 plus years. Actually, it's from 1995, so it wasn't 20 years. It was 15 years plus that we did this.
But before the index, rich people earn more.
Right.
Why is that?
Well, we think there are a number of attributes. We have 15 attributes that we look at, and we've published a lot of papers on this. But essentially, they have skin in the game. They put their own money in it. And we think that's a good thing. And there are a lot of studies which show people have skin in the game and put their own money in it, mostly stock. They keep their team tight, so they have the senior executives. There's not a lot of turnover. Compensation is well within means. So these are people who get a lot of money, in some cases billions of dollars, but they have a consistent pattern where they get paid biggest, but they get paid last. And so we like to see that sort of pattern. So they take care of their employees first. They grow organically. So for example, people know about GMCR, Green Mountain Coffee Roasters. We were a long holder in that for my fund. We held them for 5 years. We got out about a year ago. I dislike them, not as a company, I dislike the fact that they're no longer growing organically. Right? We go fast forward. We know last week they dropped 50+%. By the way, most of my picks are not like this. It's not like I'm a soothsayer and I see things in advance. But that particular company, we were publicly, we made a public announcement on that about a year ago. They got off the organic growth game. And there are a number of other factors, attributes we look at as well, but those are some of the 15 that we look at.
How about industries or types of companies?
We go across industries, and so we look at global entrepreneurs. They tend to be concentrated in tech because it's easier, fewer barriers to entry. And there's some industries which are tougher to get into, utilities, for example, because of the billions of dollars required. But we go across all industries in pretty much all countries around the world.
And so there's no characteristic that billionaires make more billionaires come out of plastics than technology or
well,
whatever?
you know, it's by period of time. So, for example, Babson, and you may not know this about me, I teach a class called Great Entrepreneurial Wealth: Creation, Preservation, Destruction. You never want to be, by the way, in the last week of the semester, because you know that's a piece on destruction. But the great wealth creation, you go over the years, the last 200 years or so, and you'll see it goes by transportation. For example, 1800s, you had machinery, car production. Rarely do you have somebody in the airline industry, by the way. But you'll see other food, clothing, textiles, and in the last 10 years or so, financial services, of course, have really been in there and have gone out and then have made it back in.
And is there anything about the period of time? In other words, why did railroads, were they the hot thing in the 1880s? And why were, during each era, what is it about the era that made certain companies the billionaire-making places?
Well, my sense is that it's demographics to a large extent. When you look at the auto industry, and in fact, Henry Ford's an interesting example for lots of reasons. Prior to Henry Ford mass-producing automobiles, the 30-year period, they only made 600 cars. So the first 30 years of auto production, 600 cars were made. And back in Europe, there was considered something for the noble, the wealthy. And Henry Ford came over here and said, no, I'm going to create it for the masses. U.S. at the time was an emerging middle-class market, expansive, wide open spaces, needed a car to get from point A to point B very quickly, and the steam locomotive just wasn't doing it. So that period of time was ripe for that circumstance. And by the way, there's a book that you're probably familiar with, Outliers, which talks about various periods of time. So for example, when Bill Gates, Steve Jobs came out in the 70s with their products, conditions were ripe for software and hardware to take off. And we're seeing now social media and so forth continuing.
Tell us a little about your methodology.
So we start off, we've got lots of great databases at Babson. As you mentioned, I'm a Babson professor. I start off with a degree in finance, so I have a PhD in finance. But we start off with massive databases. Some of my articles say 33,000, some say 50,000. I think it's up to 56,000 or so now, publicly traded companies around the world. We look at major exchanges. We want to make sure that the companies have liquidity. So we're not looking at nano caps. We don't look at companies under 50 million in market cap size. We tend not to look at micro caps, those under 200 million. So we're looking at seasoned entrepreneurial companies, those with a market cap north of 200 million, all the way up to Apple computers, which would include hundreds of billions of dollars.
Well, for the Billionaires Index, there aren't going to be any 200 million caps.
No. So you're right.
Yeah,
so I'm overlapping. You're right. I'm overlapping different studies. So my entrepreneurial base starts 200 million market cap and up. The Forbes list, obviously what we do there is we just go to the Forbes magazine. We just peel off the billionaire list. And we look for those who have made their money through, primarily through a publicly traded stock.
Okay, and then what happens? In other words, you don't take every company
in
that
Forbes?
A billionaire founded that's in the Forbes list, right? Some of them get cut out along the way.
No. Are we talking about my fund or the index?
Index.
All right. Index, no. There's no thinking about it. I mean, the beauty of that study is they're on the list, they made their wealth through publicly traded stocks, they're in the index. They don't necessarily make it to our publicly traded mutual fund, but they're in the Forbes index.
Okay, I guess I misunderstood. I thought that once the entrepreneur is out and professional management takes over, that you've got a whole different dynamic and view of the company.
You're absolutely right, for my fund.
Yes.
So the way I personally manage the fund, but not for the Forbes list. The Forbes index, just a very simple, so for example, Walmart's second, third generation, they're billionaires, they're 4 children, they're on the Forbes list. Walmart is in the Forbes index. I do not buy the stock for my mutual fund for the reasons you just mentioned, because the key, what we deem to be the key entrepreneur is out.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So
so that's a very key refinement. So the way because we don't want to overthink the index. It's just a simple model. It's there for primarily entertainment purposes, but people are interested in the super wealthy and how they're doing.
So then, again, let me know what portion of the Forbes list is part of the index.
What part of the Forbes rich list is in our index? Or what part is in our mutual fund? So
the index.
Oh, okay. So
give me again the methodology.
Right.
How does a company get into the index?
Okay. So to start with, the Forbes publication comes out with their wealthiest people on the planet, the billionaires, and I don't know, there may be 1,000 of them. Only only a portion of those go into our Forbes index. The way to get into the index, our Forbes index, is if those billionaires that Forbes identifies is the wealthiest people on the planet who have north of $1 billion. We look to see if much of their wealth, or the primary source of their wealth, was through a publicly traded stock. Okay, and we don't look to see whether they made it, they could have inherited the wealth. So there are lots of cases people inherited wealth. That's the only threshold that needs to be met in order to make the Forbes index. Now, some of those people...
Now, is that the Forbes, is that the billionaire
That's
index?
the billionaire index that we have. And some of those people are also in our publicly traded mutual fund, but it's not a perfect overlap. In fact, there's only a handful of those that actually make our mutual fund. The performance, by the way, is very similar, but it's not identical.
And why? Well, first, tell us, how does the billionaire index perform? If it were a fund, or
if it were a fund, it performs fantastic. Over the 15 years, significantly outperformed almost all the it outperformed all the peer benchmarks that we put it up against. And what we find is it tends to do very well. So it has up capture rather than down capture. So down capture, for your viewers, down capture means when the markets go down, how does it do? So basically the Forbes list, when the market goes down, they go down with the market, maybe a little bit more. Not too much more, but a little bit more. Up capture, however, talks about when the markets go up, how do they do? So when the markets go up, they tend to do better. So the up capture is very high. So the Forbes index, over a period of time, has, I think, a 4 or 5% risk-adjusted alpha, meaning even after higher risk, it does.
Now, why should that be? In other words, if the entrepreneur is still not there, you got $2 billion companies. One of them, the entrepreneur is running it. The other one, he's not, or whatever. Why should there be any difference?
Well, okay. So we believe that first of all, while the billionaire's alive, they have a lot of cash. Their networking is terrific. They probably get better deal flow.
That's how your fund invests.
Right, yeah.
And I understand that. That makes sense to me. But I don't understand why when the entrepreneur is not there anymore, why they should perform any better.
Well, and that's probably one of the reasons why. I mean, that's not probably. It is one of the reasons why we don't put them actually in our mutual fund, but we keep it in the Forbes index because we don't want to confuse the actual index in the threshold of getting in. Okay. So I agree with you.
Do you have any data or thoughts on whether these billionaire founded companies do better or worse once the professional managers take over?
We do monitor that. I haven't put out that study. In fact, I'm looking at second generations, third generations. I have about 30 or 40 sets of children who are not. So there are different things I look at. One I look when the key owner manager leaves. Okay, and by the way, there a lot of people study this, right? So I'm not the only academic on the planet studying this issue. We have different thresholds in terms of what gets in, but there have been a lot of studies looking at when they leave. Some studies show that they do better, some show that they do worse. We also are looking at when the second generation takes over, so the sons or daughters take over. We're studying that. Studies show that they generally do worse. We're looking at that as well. We're finding similar results, but I haven't documented that yet. And there are others where the entrepreneur is no longer running the companies over the side, a chief scientific officer. We see this a lot of times in some tech companies. We see it sometimes in biotech companies or medical technology companies where they had the source of information, the general idea, but they're not good managers. And so sometimes, by the way, the companies do better when you get out the owner manager because they're really bad around people. They're geniuses, but they're not good with people. So. So our feeling is we like to hold a basket, and we hold, for example, 170 plus companies globally. We don't time the market. We know that the general characteristics, by and large, work pretty well. Generally, they keep their teams tight. They bring in people who are working well together. But there are some cases when that owner manager, who is your best friend when things are going well and when they're working for you, they could be your worst nightmare when they choose to cheat you. And we've seen examples with Satyam Computers, Madoff, who didn't have a publicly traded company. I mean, we saw examples when you've got a person at the top who's bad, there's nobody worse to be behind. So we're also tracking some attributes which, they're good entrepreneurs. There's some bad ones too.
So there's no bias either way in terms of the merits of professional managers. Are they worth the huge compensation that a lot of them are getting these days?
Well, I can give you an example. This is just an anecdotal piece, but it's one that I think is interesting. When Stanley and Black & Decker came together, they merged. And we're also looking at job growth. By the way, is this interesting sidebar. Our entrepreneurial companies also tend to hire at a faster clip. And so we're now monitoring, maybe a separate interview, we'll come back and talk about that.
Okay,
but they're hiring at a faster clip, and considerably higher than the same size companies across the same industries. And we've did a very extensive study on this. But what we found, and to your point about managers, they tend to grow through acquisition more so than organic, because they tend to look at their life as a life of an NFL running back. They have a 3 to 5 year life, and so they tend to take advantage of the situation, expand compensation. So we see examples where there are companies like Stanley Black & Decker. When they come together, the costs do not necessarily go down, but the wages increase by quite a bit. So they actually fired 5,000 people, and the senior executives essentially doubled their salaries to 30+ million. So in some cases, it's not being passed along. Whereas the entrepreneur, owner, manager looks at it through a longer lens. They're not going anyplace, so maybe they're there 10, 15, 20 years, and their compensation metrics, we believe, are different.
Are there any companies that you tend to follow that are similar industry, that one has an entrepreneur leader that you think is really good, and another one that you think is not so good? Well,
for a long time, you look at the contrast between tech companies, like an Apple. I mean, pick the companies like an Apple, Google, whatever, that we're doing extraordinarily well. And Apple's usually the star for a variety of reasons. And Hewlett-Packard was the flip side. Very large company, horrible management problems, beset with all sorts of controversy between the former owner managers, the children of the founders, and senior management came in. Lots of high turnover, legendary turnover. Lots of examples like that kind of stand out, big contrast.
Among the ways you analyze these things, is there any difference among countries, in terms of how this plays out, your view, or either your fund or the Billionaire Index?
Well, network, I think, plays out a lot more globally outside the U.S. than it does in the U.S. because when you go to emerging markets, it's a much smaller network. People tend to work very closely with government. That could be good or bad, right? And so the partners. So whereas in the U.S. they tend to stay away from the government, look at government as a source of pain. In many emerging markets, but for the cooperation of the government, they wouldn't create their wealth. And since the concentration is so high, the network becomes even more important. And so we find that there are certain pockets where the wealth begets greater wealth at a much faster clip.
Final, somewhat related question. The Billionaires Index, basically, you said, particularly performs well in a growing, increasing market. So what would you say for the next 5 to 10 years? Do you expect a higher stock price, or is it going to be more of a moderate growth?
Well, I'm bullish, despite the fact that as of the date of this interview, there's some troubles again in Europe and Asia. Despite the bumpiness here in May 2012, I think the year is going to end higher than where we are today. And so over periods of time, markets tend to do well. The entrepreneurs tend to be savvy and nimble, and they tend to find the ways to create wealth. Essentially what we do is we back really smart people and allow them to figure out how to handle it. And it's a venture capital model really applied to publicly traded stocks. And so we think billionaires, like great entrepreneurs, have the network in place. Those who have created the wealth are savvy enough to know how to maneuver within difficult market conditions. And in fact, they tend to benefit, we think, when times are tough. They know how to take advantage of it.
So no matter what kind of chaos we go over the next 10 years with debt and all these things, you think somehow or other these guys will manage it and come out of it?
There are a handful of people that will always survive and do better, and we think these are the winners.
Great. Thank you so much. Really interesting. Interviewing Joel Shulman from Babson College. I'm Peter Marx. Thanks for joining us.